Hey peeps, Sara here from Sparrow Springs, and today I want to share some graphic design tips to help you with more effective visual communication. In a nutshell, just tips to help you improve with graphic design. So I've been a freelancer in the graphic design field for probably about the past decade or so for different clients, mostly by word of mouth. And I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I have learned quite a bit on the way, despite not having a formal education in graphic design. So first of all, what is graphic design? Let's get a technical definition here. Graphic design is basically the art or skill of creating a visual piece to communicate, most of the time with text, but sometimes without. So graphic design is a really important part of just our everyday life, just because it's a way to communicate a message, and there's constantly people out there trying to get their message to you. They're always trying to grab your attention and show you something, whether it's a product, service, entertainment, or whatever it might be. The list goes on. But because there is so much out there, it's really easy for pieces that aren't as strong in visual communication to kind of get tossed off to the side and forgotten or unnoticed. So it's really important to understand what makes a piece eye-catching and what is going to draw the attention of the people you're trying to reach. So I want to run through a few tips for you to make your message easier to understand, clearer, more concise, because in the end, it's those simple messages that really hit people the hardest, because they don't have to expend a whole lot of energy trying to process all the information. So I really feel like we need to start with typography, just because typography is probably the most present element in graphic design. And I really feel like if this doesn't end up just so, this is where most people run into problems. So my first tip is not to use more than 2 or 3 fonts within a design. Now I know every once in a while there's an exception to the rule. For example, this design, and I will link the credit in the description for this particular design. But usually when you have a piece with more than 2 or 3 fonts, it's because the words have become more of an art. It's more about the layout than it is about processing the information. So there's always exceptions, but when you're trying to use text as part of your message, you really do need to simplify. So keep it to 2 or 3 maximum. Otherwise, you end up with something kind of like this, and it's just jumbled and confusing. So I remember the first time I encountered something like this that really struck me. And that was when I was actually working for a local garbage company, and they were talking about advertising. So we were trying to approve ads for a phone book, and I looked at this tiny little ad, and I swear within that one ad, I don't even remember how many fonts were within that one ad, and I was absolutely shocked that anyone would pay someone to create an ad like that. So I was a receptionist, but I became a graphic designer for that day in my job. My next tip is to be careful about script fonts. Now, script fonts can be really fun, and it's just a different style. It gives off a different brand aesthetic. However, you really need to weigh the readability and the legibility of these fonts, because if you can't read it like right now, people are going to ignore it completely and it's going to get lost. My next tip is to make sure that colors don't clash. So I'm going to give you a seizure warning. If you are prone to seizures, proceed with caution. Now you may laugh, but I've literally seen people use these color combinations, and it's like, how can you even look at this and think this is okay? So a lot of times my recommendation for color is, when in doubt, use either white or black. Now, if you don't want to go with just white or black, I do recommend still going with either a really light or a really dark font against a light or dark background, so that your text is still readable. But if you don't want to go with straight black or white, choose a color family within your background, and it just makes it much more cohesive. Of course, there's always exceptions. Sometimes you want an accent color font, and that's fine as long as it still works within your piece. My next tip is to think about the hierarchy of information. So when I'm talking about hierarchy, I'm talking about what is the most important thing you want to convey. Whatever that piece of information is, you want to make sure that that is the first thing that people notice. So this can be your text is bigger, or your text is a different color, or it might be a visual aspect. Maybe you're looking at a photo of something and then you have other information below it. But you just want to make sure that whatever you want to stand out, that is the first thing you notice. So if you're thinking more utility-based graphic design, then say you have an event, you would want the title of your event to be first, and then the date and the address. And any kind of other information can be more body text, but think about what is the most important thing. In the terms of graphic design, it's a form of art, but I would say that the principles of art actually apply more so in graphic design than they would in fine art, because fine art is a lot of times more up to the interpretation of the artist, and a lot of times anything goes as long as it strikes a chord with the viewer. But with graphic design, it's not as forgiving because you need to catch people's attention right now. So because of this, my next tip is to watch your lines. Pay attention to the composition. Where are you placing your focus? Don't place it dead center, and don't place it near the edge. Make sure that the focus is in the right spot. Do you have leading lines going to that subject? Pay attention to where your eye falls. Look at a piece, and what's the first thing you notice? What's the second? Can you create a path throughout the piece to where your eye is going? You want to keep the viewer's eye in that picture as long as possible. Now, in the subject of lines, we're also going to talk about space. So space gives things room to breathe. If you have things within close proximity, things feel crowded. So if you're going to be in close proximity or close to overlapping, make that overlapping intentional. You don't want it to make it seem like it's a mistake. Now, my next tip, contrast is key. Contrast is also something that really brings a viewer's eye in, whether it's your contrast in values, your lights and darks, or your colors, concepts. Is it big and small? Contrast your fonts. Pattern and texture is good, but contrast is really what gets a person's attention. So if you have a uniform pattern, it's comfortable, it's normal. But when you have contrast and something feels out of place, that catches people's attention. So my next tip is to make sure that your color matches your message. Think of bright colors as more attention getters and more of your blues and your cool colors as more calming. Now you would think that, well, I want everybody to pay attention to my artwork, so I'm going to use bright colors, but you have to make it work. So if you have an advertisement for a spa, you don't want to be using bright, obnoxious colors if you want people to come there and relax. And on the flip side, you probably don't want to use all of these calming, serene colors if it's like for a gym and you want people to get their energy up and go work out. So be consistent in this. So I really feel like all of this can be summed up into one phrase: less is more. A lot of times if a message isn't clear, sometimes we think that we can add more and add more specifics to make it clearer, but that's not always the case. I've seen this way too much, and a lot of times when I'm doing graphic design work for a client, a lot of times I have to ask them, what can I take out? Because you have too much going on, it's too busy, and if you can't convey your message in one sentence or less, then you might need to rethink your concept. When you have too many pieces, it feels cluttered, confusing, overwhelming, and your viewer will tune out before they even have the chance to process what you're trying to communicate. So real quick, I want to just show you a real-world application. So I'm going to pull up an image here. Now, there's a lot going on in this, and it feels busy, and it's a little bit hard to read. So we have a multitude of sins in this one. So it reads, less is more, a concept that is easier said than done. So I wanted a contrast of the idea that less is more, but have a busy image in the background. But there's a lot of things wrong with this. So I've got 5 fonts in here, which is way too much. The text is hard to read. One of the fonts is really, really scripty. Actually, I've got 2 really scripty ones in there. And it's just the contrast is almost too much. And there's too many lines all over the place in the background. There's some things that can be improved. I see this a lot of times that people put in an image and they don't adjust their image accordingly because it's like, well, I really like this image. I want people to see this. And what they don't realize is that you can actually subdue an image and still get the same kind of feel that you're going for. So I'm going to flip over to a revised version of this image. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but it is certainly a lot easier to read, and I feel like it still conveys the message. So I have reduced it down to 2 fonts. However, I have 3 different ways that one font is displayed just to give it some variety, but you're not actually changing up the fonts at all. And then I have one that's more of a pop of color, accent color, and the image, even though the image is still subdued, you can still see those leading lines and all of the kind of chaos in the midst of it. So I still feel like the message is still there, but you're more likely to process this message faster than with the other one. So those are my tips for improving your designs and making your message more clear. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps me out. And that's all for now. I'll see you later, peeps.